Despite the Orioles' loss, Zach Eflin returned and started the journey to rebuilding his trade value. But if the Orioles are able to deal him, what do deadline deals from the past few years tell us about how much Eflin can really get back in a trade? We'll get to that coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Thursday, July 24th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are going to recap another Orioles loss as they fall 3-2 to the Cleveland Guardians. On Wednesday night, we'll talk about Zach Eflin's return from the injured list and the Orioles offense continuing to struggle. And then we'll take a look back at the past few deadlines, specifically looking at some players who were dealt that are similar to the guys that the Orioles could trade before next week's deadline. And let's do a comparison. What did teams get back for those players in trades over the past few years? And what does that tell us about what the Orioles should expect to get back from the players they're going to deal this year, like Ryan O'Hearn, Cedric Mullins, Charlie Morton, and others? But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. Before we get there, though, just did want to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first podcast listen of the day. We're free and available on all podcast listening platforms. So if you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show, subscribe, leave a 5-star rating and a review. Really helps us out. And we're here on YouTube as well. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. And if you want to talk ball, got some mailbag questions, have any thoughts on the show, whatever it may be, you can always email me, lockedonorioles@gmail.com. So let's start with another Orioles loss. Guardians 3 and the O's 2 was the final score on Wednesday night, game 3 of a 4-game set in Cleveland, in which the Guardians have won all 3 and the O's have now dropped 5 of 6 since the All-Star break, and they have dropped 7 of 8 overall to completely fall out of anything close to contention where they can even consider not being sellers at the deadline. The Orioles are now 44-57 on the season. The Guardians, after a 10-game losing streak, have won 11 of 13 and are now back over 500 at 51-50. But let's start with what went right for the Orioles in their loss on Wednesday, and that's that Zach Eflin returned from the injured list, and he looked pretty solid. First start for Eflin since June 28th. He'd been on the injured list with a lower back issue, but he was activated on Wednesday. Brandon Young was optioned down to AAA Norfolk to make room for Eflin. And Eflin's had some injury issues this year. He had the back. He missed a month earlier in the season with a lat strain. And, he had his moments, but mostly in between the injuries, it had been pretty bad. And in the final 3 starts he made before going on the IL with the lower back issue, Eflin threw 9 innings, allowed 27 hits, 17 earned runs, 6 strikeouts, 4 walks, and 6 home runs allowed in that stretch. He was absurdly bad. The final start, he only threw 1 inning. He felt some back pain in the bullpen warming up. He tried to go out there and give it a go. He gave up 4 runs in the first inning and had to be pulled out of the game with that injury. But what we saw Wednesday night looked a lot closer to the usual Zach Eflin we've seen for most of the time since the Orioles acquired him about a year ago at the deadline. Eflin goes 5 innings, allowing 2 runs on 2 hits with 5 strikeouts, 1 walk, and critically no home runs. The homers have been a huge issue for him. He threw 84 pitches. Guardians batters had just 5 hard hit balls against him in the 5 innings, and this looked like much closer to what we are used to from Zach Eflin. And maybe in a different start when he's not coming right off the IL, he's allowed to pitch into the 6th at just 84 pitches overall. But the lineup also was turning over. It was the top of the lineup due up in Steven Kwan to start the 6th. That's also a part of your decision. But he mixed all 6 of his pitches. He only threw 1 sweeper, but he did throw all 6 total. And I thought the curveball was really good. He got 5 whiffs on it. He threw it 22 times, which was his most used pitch of the night. It was a 26% curveball usage for Eflin, which was his highest number of the season. On average, he was throwing his curveball just 15% of the time on the year coming in. And you like to see that because in 2023, Eflin's final full season with the Rays, he was really, really good that year for Tampa Bay. He threw his curveball 26% of the time that season. It was his number 2 most used pitch. And metrically, strikeout-wise, stuff-wise, it was his best pitch that season. It's been good since then, but hasn't been that good. So to see him get his usage up to what it was when the curveball was great and have it work really well like it did on Wednesday, that is a good sign for Eflin moving forward. He only had 1 walk, which is vintage Zach Eflin, and that 1 walk was a 9-pitch plate appearance against Stephen Kwan, a guy who refuses to strike out. So, of course, that's where his 1 walk is going to be. And the other part that was interesting, his velocity was actually up about 1 mile per hour across the board. So apparently, getting healthy, getting the back issues out of the way, getting that velo back up a little bit, which is certainly a good sign. Now, Eflin's next scheduled start would be on Monday at home against the Blue Jays. So that would schedule him for 1 more start before next Thursday's trade deadline. And if that start on Monday also goes well, at the very least, if it goes like Wednesday nights did, you can trade him if you want to. And that's a decision the Orioles still have to make at this point. But we were looking a couple of weeks ago with him on the IL and being terrible beforehand and saying no one's going to want him. But as I said, if he makes 1 to 2 starts off the injured list before the deadline and looks good, teams are going to see that and also add in how good his track record's been over the past couple of years and are going to want to take a chance on him. Maybe the O's try to deal him before Monday so he doesn't have a chance to flip it around and have a bad start. But again, if he looks good on Monday, he's right back in the mix of guys the Orioles could actually get something for in a trade. And coming up later, we'll talk about what exactly they could get if they do trade away Eflin. Now, what went wrong in this one? Well, the Orioles, again, just could not hit the ball. A Ryan O'Hearn sac fly in the 4th and a Jackson Holiday solo home run in the 6th. That accounted for the Orioles' only 2 runs on 5 hits and 3 walks in the game. They did get 2nd and 3rd with nobody out in the 3rd inning and then ran themselves into 2 outs on the bases and did not score. That was kind of their other best chance to put runs on the board. And they have now scored 5 runs or fewer in 13 of the now 14 of 17 games in July. Now they've scored 5 or fewer. These stats are entering Wednesday, so this doesn't even include Wednesday when they didn't hit the ball well. An 80 team WRC plus in the month is 29th. Only the Rockies have been worse. 55 runs in the month also is 29th in baseball. They're 26th in average, 29th in on base, 26th in slugging, 28th in walk rate, 20th in barrel percentage. This offense has just been terrible in the month of July, which has allowed them to just kind of fully go into, we're not turning this thing around. And this is after the Orioles had that great bounce back. I mean, they were one of the best offenses in baseball in the month of June. That's why they played so much better in that month. And they've now gone completely in the other direction once again. And the shout out for Wednesday, I guess, goes to the Orioles bullpen just because it had been so bad in the first 2 losses in this series. In those first 2 games, Monday and Tuesday night, the Oriole pen combined to throw 7 innings, allowed 9 runs on 11 hits with 6 strikeouts to 9 walks in that stretch. That was horrendous. They were much, much better in this one. Andrew Kittredge threw a 1-2-3-6 to keep the game tied. Yennier Cano threw a 1-2-3-7 to keep the game time. And once again, like I talked about on Tuesday, I liked that Tony Mansolino went to Colin Selby in a 2-2 game in the bottom of the 8th inning. It was the bottom third. It was 7, 8, 9 due up in the Guardians order. And unfortunately, after Selby got the first 2 hitters, he gave up a double to Bo Naylor, the 9-man. And then, Stephen Kwan's a great hitter, and he poked an RBI single in left center field and gave the Guardians a 3-2 lead there in the 8th. Selby did eventually get a big strikeout of Jose Ramirez to finish the inning and only give up the 1. But like I said on Tuesday, right, when the Orioles used Corbin Martin, Grant Wolfram, and Colin Selby in kind of big spots out of the bullpen, and none of them really had a great outing, I talked about how at this point, the Orioles are out of it. It is more about development now and getting this team ready to try and compete again in 2026 more than it is about trying to win singular games every night. And giving Colin Selby that spot in a tie game in the 8th inning is a move that leans towards development. You're saying, hey, Selby has a chance to be in our bullpen next year. He's got the stuff to do it. He's a guy who the Orioles had on their postseason roster last year. They clearly like Colin Selby, but you got to get him in more high leverage spots down the stretch to see what kind of role he can play for you next year. And this was that spot. If this were a month ago, would Colin Selby get that opportunity? Absolutely not. They would have, pushed Dominguez back out there or pushed Soto back out there and gotten ready to use Bautista. But in this spot, they're going to go to Selby to see what he can do. And it wasn't awful, but he did give up a run. And he's going to continue to work through that and get these kinds of chances down the stretch. And I like that the Orioles have seemed to kind of turn that page this week, right? To focusing a little bit more on the development. It's going to make it some nights even harder to watch this team than it already is. Like, I will fully admit that. But this is an important step in the right direction to turn this thing around and get ready for 2026. The O's played a whole lot better baseball Wednesday than they did on Monday or Tuesday night in Cleveland, but it still ends up being a loss to the Guardians. They have officially lost the series. And as we know, this Orioles team is going to be sellers at the trade deadline a week from now. But this is a lot of a question I've gotten, and I've mentioned it a few times, talked about it a bit on the podcast over the past few weeks, but the Orioles have a lot of guys to trade, but most of them are also rental players, which means, they are free agents after this year. Teams are only getting them for, maybe 2 months and change. You're not going to give up a lot prospect-wise to get a player potentially for 2 months and have him leave in free agency in the offseason. That's why you give up more and you get more back if you trade away controllable players, guys who aren't hitting free agency, at least have, maybe another full year or more on their contract. But the Orioles, again, after the Baker deal, are mostly going to be trading rentals next week. So what could they expect to reasonably get back in those trades? We've seen some people say, hey, the Orioles have a lot to trade away, and others be like, well, are they really going to get much back for these rentals? So I did a deep dive back into the last few trade deadlines and looked at the players that are similar to what the Orioles have now and try to look back at those teams. What did they get? How did it work out? And what does that mean for what the price will be and the offers will be for the Orioles tradable pieces this year? We'll break that down coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Game Day Hue. For Orioles fans like me, this product, it hits the mark. Game Day Hue makes clean, no logo gear with team-inspired colorways for every pro and college fan base. It's all about letting your colors speak for you. No giant logos, just smart, versatile style that works on game day, on the course, or anywhere in between. Now, I got a couple of hats from Game Day Hue, and they are perfect, right? I can wear them to the Orioles game, but also it's not a big gaudy logo, right? It's white and orange. You feel like you can kind of wear it anywhere. And that's what it's great for. I also got a golf glove. Now, I'm not a golfer, but gave it to my brother, and he wore it on the course yesterday. And it's great to wear the golf glove out there as well. And it's not just hats. You can check out their split shade gloves made for the golf course, as I mentioned, or the perfect gift for the fan who has everything. And right now, you can get 15% off with code MLB15 at GameDayHue.com. That's GameDayHue.com. The code even stacks on bundle deals, so now's the time to load up. Let your colors talk, because colors speak louder than words. That's GameDayHue.com and use code MLB15. So as we mentioned, the O's are going to be sellers. They got a lot of rental pieces to trade away. What can they reasonably expect to get back in these trades? That is the research that I did. I put together a spreadsheet that I'm actually going to link in the show notes here on your podcast listening platforms or on YouTube, where you can actually click on this spreadsheet and see kind of all the names, because I'm not going to go through every single trade I compiled here, but you can see it after the fact if you would like to, and let me know if anybody has, email me if anybody has any issues accessing the spreadsheet when I do put it in the show notes. But I wanted to run through some of the players the Orioles are probably going to trade, some players that are similar to them that were traded in previous years, and what those trades look like. Now, the furthest I really went back for this is 2021's deadline. You go back to 2020, the COVID year deadline was super weird. And then anything pre-COVID just feels too far away. So I think 2021 was the furthest I looked back. That's when you have the modern evaluation of prospects from teams and young players and team control and all that good stuff. And trades have looked a little different since then, right? Teams are holding on to their players a little bit more. So let's start with the rental relievers, right? The Orioles have two true ones in Seranthony Dominguez and Gregory Soto, and then they have Andrew Kittredge, who does have a $9 million team option for 2026, but also could be dealt in that pack. Now, every single deadline, rental relievers are dealt. It was not hard to go back and find a chunk of well-performing rental relievers who were traded away at the deadline. But I want to talk about some of the ones that kind of fit almost exactly to what the Orioles have here. Let's start with Andrew Chafin, veteran left-handed pitcher who was traded last year from the Tigers to the Texas Rangers. He had a 3.16 ERA at the time of the trade. He had good strikeout numbers, and he had a pretty good track record for years and years of being a solid veteran left-handed reliever. For me, it's not an exact one-to-one comparison, but it's fairly close to what the Orioles have in Gregory Soto. Now, Gregory Soto is 4 years younger than Chafin. He also has much better stuff and throws a lot harder. In terms of, what the stats look like for Gregory Soto, Chafin had a little bit of a lower ERA. Soto's at 4.08 right now, but, with the stuff and what he's done in his past, it's fairly similar values you think you could get for those guys. And what the Tigers got back was 2 pitching prospects. They got Joseph Montalvo, who at the time was a 22-year-old, 40 future value pitcher in high A, who had some really good numbers. He was an athletic guy, but he was Rule 5 eligible last winter. And then they also got Chase Lee, who was a 25-year-old right-handed submarine reliever who was in AAA. And Lee has spent a good chunk of this season in the big league bullpen for the Tigers. Kind of an up and down reliever, but he spent a chunk of the year in their bullpen. So at the very least, they were able to get a bullpen piece back. And then if you look at Montalvo, he is now up in AA. He is 23 years old. He is the 21st ranked prospect in their system, kind of a command over stuff guy who's been okay in 10 starts in AA this year. So that's kind of what they were able to get from a player like that. So you look at Gregory Soto and you say, the O's aren't going to bring him back. He's been okay. If you can get a guy who can help your bullpen next year and then somewhat of a lottery ticket starting pitching prospect who's in AA, I think I'd take that for Gregory Soto. And that's what the Orioles should potentially be targeting. How about some other trades that match up to a guy like Seranthony Dominguez, right? I took a look at a guy like, I feel like Jimmy Garcia was a solid guy to compare here. Now, Jimmy Garcia last year at the deadline was traded from the Blue Jays to the Mariners. Now, he was having a great season. He had a 2.70 ERA, had really good strikeout to walk numbers. His numbers across the board were better than Dominguez. But he was also coming off an injury, and there were a lot of questions about how good Garcia would be because it was an arm injury. Now, Dominguez's stats aren't as good, but he's been great lately, and he's been pretty much healthy. The Blue Jays were able to get Jonathan Clase, a 22-year-old switch-hitting outfielder in AAA who had some elite speed and some good numbers. Clase's kind of been up and down with the Blue Jays this year. And then they got 22-year-old catcher Jacob Sharp, who is a low-A guy with good contact skills. For me, that's not exactly what I would like the Orioles to go get, but it kind of shows you what the going price is for a reliever like that. Let's go back to 2023 because there are some interesting ones there as well. How about a guy like Pierce Johnson, right? He was a right-handed pitcher who went from the Rockies to the Braves at the 2023 deadline. He had a 6 ERA, but he had this giant strikeout rate, and the Braves knew, hey, as soon as we get him out of Colorado, he's going to be good. And that's what they did, and they got what I thought was an interesting return. They got 2 right-handed pitchers. One was Victor Vodnik, at the time a 23-year-old relief pitcher who is just putting up outstanding numbers in AA. Well, Vodnik got to the big leagues last year, less than a year after the trade, and he's probably the second, and it's not a good bullpen, but he's probably the second or third best reliever in the Rockies bullpen right now. He would be a useful relief piece on a lot of teams right now. And that's what the Orioles should be looking for, especially when they're trading these rental relievers who don't have the biggest value. Hey, he's got a 3 ERA in the Rockies bullpen right now, and he's only 25. They also were able to get Tanner Gordon back, who was a 25-year-old starting pitcher who was in AAA and was definitely having some issues at the AAA level. Gordon's been, solid in 3 starts in the big leagues this year with Colorado. He made 8 starts in the big leagues last year and wasn't very good. So it's hard to compare players how they do with the Rockies, but they were legitimate pitching prospects when the Braves gave them up to Colorado. How about the Jordan Hicks trade as a comparison as well? Now, Hicks had a 3.67 ERA, big strikeout rates, big walk rates. I think he's a pretty good, honestly, comparison to Seranthony Dominguez. The only difference really is that Hicks just had bigger stuff, or he could touch 104 with his fastball. So maybe that gives him a little more value than Dominguez would, but pretty similar kind of rental right-handed reliever, setup guy, command issues, but huge stuff. The Cardinals traded him to the Blue Jays and again, got back a solid return. Sam Roberts was a 21-year-old right-handed pitcher in AA who had great command, but didn't have gigantic upside. And then Adam Kloffenstein was a 22-year-old right-handed pitcher also in AA who was putting up some really good numbers. And at that time, that felt like a pretty good return for a pitcher like that. Guys who seemed to be looking like they were going to get to the big leagues. Unfortunately, Roberts got to AAA last year, was okay. Then he was bad in AAA this year. And then he got Tommy John surgery this season, which is always an issue with bringing in pitchers, is that they tend to get injured. On the Kloffenstein side, he came over to St. Louis. He pitched in one game in the big leagues that year. The Cardinals released him, and he is now back with Toronto in AAA, not putting up great numbers. So that return looked solid at the time to pitching prospects, and they've kind of amounted to nothing, at least to this point. You know, Roberts is still in the system getting Tommy John in AAA, but they've amounted to nothing at this point 2 years later. And that's the other side of the concern. Basically, to put it, like, you can get some guys who have a chance to pop, right? You can get the Victor Vodnik type guys who are going to potentially help you out. You can get the Chase Lee type guys who are going to help you out, but you also aren't going to get the best of the best prospects because they're rental relievers. They're kind of lowest on the pole of how much they are worth. Now, another return that I thought was interesting is for Luis Garcia. That was at last year's deadline. Veteran right-handed reliever, had a 3.71 ERA at the time, had a long track record, but was getting a little older. I honestly think Dominguez is worth more than Garcia was at the time of the trade, but he was traded from the Angels to the Red Sox, and the Angels went for some quality, but went for more quantity in that trade. They got Ryan Zefirjan, who was a 26-year-old right-handed reliever who was struggling in AAA after dominating AA and throwing 100. He's now maybe the best reliever in the Angels bullpen. They got outfielder Matthew Lugo, was a 23-year-old, like, fringy major leaguer who was dominating AA and was looking pretty good in AAA. He has debuted this year for the Angels. They got Nico Cavadas, this big power hitting DH with kind of no position. He's debuted for them. And then they got Jefferson Vargas, who was a 19-year-old in rookie ball who was kind of a lottery ticket throw-in. That's an approach the Orioles could take. 3 guys who are pretty close to the big leagues but don't have giant upside, and then 1 throw-in, and you hope one of those 3 guys can help you in 2026. That's another way that the Orioles could absolutely kind of approach this thing. So let's move from relief pitchers to starting pitchers, right? Because the Orioles have some guys to trade. We know they're going to deal Charlie Morton. We'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow, but apparently the Padres and some other teams have some interest in Charlie Morton. And again, if Zach Eflin makes another start and looks good again on Monday, then I think they're going to deal Eflin. I really still don't think they're going to be able to find someone who actually wants Tomoyuki Sugano, so they're probably holding on to him. But they could deal 2 of these guys in Eflin and Morton. Now let's go back to last year's deadline. These are kind of the rental middle to back of the rotation starting pitchers. That's where I would put the current state of Charlie Morton and Zach Eflin. Frankie Montas was a really interesting deal last year. Like, Montas went from the Reds to the Brewers. He had a 5.01 ERA and 19 starts for the Reds by the deadline, but he had a much better track record than that of being better, but he was coming off injury. Kind of sounds like what Zach Eflin is going through right now, right? A guy with a 5 ERA who'd been much, much better in his track record, but there was injury concerns. And the Reds got an interesting return. They got Joey Wiemer, who was a 25-year-old right-handed hitting outfielder who had been in the big leagues with the Brewers for the past couple of years. Good center field defender, good power, but his bat has not really come around at all at the big league level. So it was kind of a guy they were taking a chance on and then hoping he would click. Wiemer was basically set free by Cincinnati. They didn't really want him. He is now in AAA with the Royals and not hitting at all. So that one didn't really work. And they also got Jacob Junis, who was another interesting move because Junis, more of a veteran guy, right? He was 31 years old at the time of the trade. He was pitching in the big leagues, pitching really well for Milwaukee, and he pitched really well for Cincinnati down the stretch. He had a 2.85 ERA in 41 innings. He started, he relieved, he didn't walk guys. And Junis has been pretty solid out of the Guardians bullpen this year, 3.51 ERA in 41 innings, but Cincinnati didn't bring him back. Like, he was another rental player. So at the end of the day, they really didn't get much. Like, they tried to get guys who would potentially help them down the stretch, kind of stay in the race, but that was just not a good trade. That's not something I'd be looking for the Orioles to potentially do. So let's go back to 2023, some of these type of starting pitchers who were dealt at the deadline. And these are the kind of trades where if I'm the Orioles, I'm trying to make happen. Like, you look at the Jack Flaherty trade, right? That's maybe very similar to Charlie Morton. Flaherty had a 4.43 ERA in 20 starts. He goes from the Cardinals to the Orioles. The O's give up Cesar Prieto, Drew Rom, and Zach Showalter. Well, Prieto's just been kind of stuck in AAA. We know he has really good bat-to-ball skills, and we know that the Cardinals haven't exactly been a super winning team, but he's basically been a league average bat in AAA for the past 2 years. Not exactly what you want. Drew Rom got surgery, and I think he's still he's still in AAA with the Cardinals, but it hasn't gone super well. He's now made 4 starts back in AAA this season, but he's only still 25, but he hasn't really worked out for them at all. And then when it comes to Showalter, he was seen as the biggest piece of the trade because he had the highest upside. He's 21 years old, and he has been struggling, and the walks have been horrible, and he got injured, and he's kind of rehabbing in the complex league. He was dealing with a shoulder issue. Like, that trade really hasn't worked out. They didn't get at least a lot back, and that's what you get concerned about. What that tells me is you maybe try to do one of these package deals. There were 3 of them at the 2023 deadline. The Cardinals packaged Jordan Montgomery and Chris Stratton to the Rangers. The White Sox packaged Lance Lynn and Joe Kelly to the Dodgers. And the White Sox packaged Lucas Giolito and Ronaldo Lopez to the Angels. And these kind of stick out to me. Jordan Montgomery had a 3.42 ERA in 21 starts. Chris Stratton had a 4.19 ERA in 54 innings out of the bullpen. The Orioles don't have a rental starter right now who's as good as Jordan Montgomery, but if you did like Morton and Dominguez certainly better than Chris Stratton. They got Thomas Agazy, a good like contact hitter, 21-year-old hitting over 330 in AA. He is now debuted with the Cardinals. They got Tekoa Roby, 21-year-old 50 future value starting pitcher who did have a shoulder injury in AA. He's kind of knocking on the door of the big leagues now. And they got John King, who was kind of a solid left-handed big league reliever who'd been in the major since 2020 and did have some minor league options. That's the kind of return, if I'm the Orioles, that I'm looking for. You get Roby, who's maybe a year away, but a good pitching prospect, Sagasi, who could help you, and King, who's a guy you could put in your bullpen right now and can help you immediately. Maybe a better combination is like the Lance Lynn and Joe Kelly trade. Lynn was struggling. Kelly was okay with good strikeout numbers. That feels like a Morton Dominguez return. The White Sox were able to get from the Dodgers Nick Nastrini, who ended up not being as good as they thought, and they DFA'd him. But Jordan Leisure has become a good part of their bullpen with some big stuff. But at the end of the day, you're looking at these players and like, Connor, there's not really an impact prospect. Like Roby's maybe the only one, and the Orioles don't have a player like Montgomery to give up. And that's kind of the point here. Like, you're going to get some guys who could work, but it's hard to do so with these rental pitchers. So do the hitters bring back any more? Let's look back at some hitter trades coming up next to finish off the show. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Monarch Money. Ever wish managing your money felt easier? Well, with Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. And Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you are also building wealth. And the app is super easy to manage money day to day. And I share finances with my wife. Monarch helps us stay on the same page. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONMLB at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONMLB for half off your first year. So we've looked back at some of those rental pitcher trades. Let's look back at some of the rental hitter trades that have been made. Let's start with kind of rental center fielders, kind of like Cedric Mullins. And the funny thing is, there have not been many trades made of rental center fielders. The only 2 I found were 2021, when the Cubs sent Jock Peterson and his 92 WRC+, so slightly worse than Mullins, to the Atlanta Braves. Now, Peterson had played like 30-some games in center field that year. He wasn't a true center fielder, but he could still play the position. So kind of a rental center fielder with a near average bat. And the Cubs got back Bryce Ball, who was a 23-year-old first baseman in AA with huge power but average stats, and he's become nothing. The only other time I found this was you had to go back to 2018 when the Rays traded Alex Colomé, the reliever, and Denard Span, who was having a pretty good season but was only playing a little center field at that point, to the Mariners. And they got a 24-year-old Andrew Moore who, was kind of like a struggling starting pitcher in Double-A. And then Tommy Romero was a guy in Low-A with good numbers. So I have no idea what Cedric Mullins. I've said this like 20 times in the past week. I have no idea what Cedric Mullins is worth via trade. That's a mystery to me. And that's why I think the Oilers are just going to hold on to Mullins. Because, there's no precedent for this. And I don't know if any team knows truly what his value is. But let's move on to the guys who always get traded, right? Just like rental relievers are always dealt, these rental cornerbacks, first basemen, corner outfielders like Ryan O'Hearn are traded at every deadline. Now, maybe they're not as good as O'Hearn has been this year. How about Jesse Winker? Last year had a 125 WRC plus with the Nationals, corner outfielder, left-handed bat, just a little bit worse version of Ryan O'Hearn. Obviously wasn't an all-star and was playing less than O'Hearn. Went from the Nats to the Mets, and the Nats got Tyler Stewart back, a 24-year-old, 40 future value, right-handed starting pitching prospect who was pitching very well in Double-A at the time of the trade. Tyler Stewart at the moment is still in Double-A, and is struggling with some elbow stuff. He is on the injured list, and I don't think he's gotten Tommy John yet, but, it's an elbow injury for a pitcher. How about Jeimer Candelario? Had a 122 WRC plus. Again, not as good as Ryan O'Hearn. Went from the Nats to the Cubs in 2023. Kevin Made got traded, 20-year-old shortstop who was playing well in high A, and then this was the part of the trade that worked well. DJ Hertz was the other one. Left-handed pitcher. He was 22 years old at the time. Big stuff in Double-A, but had some reliever risk. Kevin Made at this point, I'm not really sure what he is Made of himself. He's in Double-A, not playing super well for the Nationals, but DJ Hertz at the time looked like a really good pickup. He came to the big leagues last year and was great in 19 starts for the Nationals. Unfortunately, Hertz got Tommy John this April. He's out for all of this year and a chunk of next year as well. So he was a guy who could come back and be really good. He's still only 24 years old, and he's at some point next year is going to be a legitimate piece of the National starting rotation. And I'd take that for the Orioles. But again, he also got Tommy John, which is what has happened to a lot of these guys we've talked about on this list. Honestly, the best thing you can compare it to, positivity-wise, is a trade the Orioles made 3 years ago. Trey Mancini, expiring contract, rental bat, having a 117 WRC plus, 105 the year before, so not as good as O'Hearn, righty instead of a lefty, probably slightly worse in the outfield than O'Hearn is. And the Orioles were able to get Chase McDermott and Seth Johnson for him. McDermott, who's been their number one pitching prospect for a good chunk of time, and Johnson, who was a good pitching prospect, they were able to flip to the Phillies for Gregory Soto last year. If they can make that trade again for Ryan O'Hearn, that's what you're trying to do. Two arms who are maybe a year or so away from the big leagues that have big stuff and can really help you. Just do what you did last time, and it may work out okay. And then the other kind of player I looked at was Ramon Laureano, because he's kind of a rental, but he also has that $6.5 million team option for 2026, which means you can team control him for a little bit longer. Lane Thomas was someone that was interesting for me. Thomas had a 107 WRC plus for the Nationals last year, had a year and a half left on his deal, so wasn't as good as Laureano, but had a little more consistent track record at times. The Nats from the Guardians got Alex Clemmy, a 19-year-old left-handed pitcher who was in Low-A, putting up big stuff and good numbers. 19-year-old shortstop Rafael Ramirez Jr. in Low-A. And then they got Jose Tena, who had debuted in 2023 and was an infielder who's kind of played like a utility role for the Nationals this season. Not really the return the Orioles would want, but some value in that. How about the Darren Ruff trade? He had a 105 WRC plus, went from the Giants to the Mets in 2022, but had been great the previous 2 years. The Giants got J.D. Davis back. He was kind of an MLB help at that time. They got Thomas Szapucki, I believe. Szapucki, how you say his name? He was a 26-year-old starting pitcher who had great AAA numbers and had already debuted. They got Nick Swack in that deal, 24-year-old starting pitcher with incredible numbers in high A. And they got Carson Seymour, who was putting up some really good high A numbers. And Carson Seymour is currently with the Giants. He's pitching out of the bullpen at the moment, but I think they at least think there's a chance at 26 he can still be a starter in the big leagues because he was a great starter in AAA this year. So if you can get a guy like Carson Seymour, that's great, but a lot of those guys were also kind of far away from the big leagues. And again, you can get more value out of someone like Laureano, right? Like Andrew Benintendi, when he was traded from the Royals to the Yankees, having a really good year in 2022 during that deal. The Royals got 3 really interesting pitching prospects out of the Yankees system that year, But those three prospects, one of them was in low A and the other two were in high A. The Orioles need to be getting guys back who are at worst in double A and hopefully already in triple A. And you can plan on them helping you out at some point in 2026. That's what you got to be targeting. And that's not a lot of the kind of players that are in these deals. And that is, I think, the biggest takeaway here. Like the Orioles can look for pitching in these deals and they can get pitching, right? All these deals pretty much that I've talked about have included a promising young pitcher in the minor leagues. But most of them are at the double A level and below. And the ones that are at triple A, are already relievers at this point or already have a lot of questions or never really amounted to much, right? If you're getting more valuable players, it's probably guys who are going to be further away. The O's are in a tough spot where they really should be targeting guys who are closer because, again, the plan is to flip it around and compete again next year, and you want guys who can help you do that. That should be the goal. If you get a good value trade here and there, again, they're going to have a lot of players to deal away. So if some of these deals get younger guys with higher upside, that's fine, but some of them have to bring in close to big league ready talent. And that's the part that's kind of humbling here. Like the Orioles have a lot to trade away. But in these deals, when you just look back on the past, there's not a lot of big league ready pitchers, whether it be starters or even relievers, that really get dealt in these rental deals like this. So the Orioles are going to have to get creative. Maybe it is combining these guys to get a better package. And that's what we saw in some of the trades we look back on, those combinations of, Montgomery and Stratton, or those combinations of, Colomé and Denard Span from years ago. There was a CJ Cron, Randall Grichuk combo trade that got the Rockies a little bit more back in 2023. Like, those might have to be the kinds of deals that you make, combining a Morton and a Dominguez, putting together an Eflin and a Soto, an O'Hearn and a Kittredge together in a deal to just extract more value because so many of them are rental players with that limited value that you have. It's going to be really interesting, but I hope this did help. And again, this full spreadsheet is going to be put in the show notes. You can take a look at all the trades that I went back and researched on. But that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for jumping in and enjoying this one. And again, I know these have been kind of longer episodes this week, but we're trying to recap some games that I really don't want to talk about because they keep losing, but I'm going to get you that Orioles content and still dive deep into the trade deadline because we are only 1 week away from that deadline next Thursday, July 31st at 6 p.m. Eastern time. But the Orioles do play baseball somewhat unfortunately again today. And Charlie Morton's taking the hill. Potentially his final start as an Oriole. He would be scheduled to make one more before the deadline, but it could be his last one. It's a 1-10 start, little day baseball. Logan Allen, the lefty, goes for the Guardians in this one. He's got a 4.06 ERA in 19 starts, and he's been pretty good lately for Cleveland. O's will try to avoid getting mopped by the Guardians in this 1-10 game. And then I will be back tomorrow, recap everything you need to know from the final game between the O's and Cleveland. I'll get you ready for the Colorado Rockies coming to town. There are some games the Orioles should hopefully be able to win this weekend. I'll get you ready for that series. And then we're going to jump into all the latest trade rumors with the Orioles. Some talk about Zach Eflin and Charlie Morton and guys like Ryan O'Hearn and Trevor Rogers and Felix Bautista. All the rumor mill swirling. We'll get to it all on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.